leveraging networks.
Precisely. What we're going to do in the next 3 hours is the following. Refreshments? No, no refreshments. We're going to ask each of the 6 distinguished panelists, who I'll introduce in a second, to comment on what they heard this morning. Thereafter, we'll open it up to questions from the audience. And after the questions from the audience, we will turn it into, I don't mean it as a free-for-all, but a free-for-all in order to ask them to try to put forth concrete policy recommendations in terms of where do we go from here. Because one of the most important aspects of this conference on Professor Hill's perspective and mine is to have this become concretized, so not to leave it as some abstract intellectual exercise, but to have some positive, if not possibly concrete responses and concrete proposals. So let's go, let me introduce our panelists, and I will make this relatively quick, and you all will excuse me for going through your impressive CVs quickly. On the far right is Professor Chesney. Raise your hand, Bobby. Right. From Wake Forest. He is one of the most important young voices in the field of national security. He is a prolific writer, has published at the most important places in the business, Michigan Law Review, North Carolina Law Review, Harvard Journal Legislation, and we really are here at CASE very gratified that you've joined us today. Bruce Hoffman, I don't have to introduce. Dr. Hussain, raise your hand, sir, is a professor emeritus of thoracic and cardiovascular surgery at the University of Toledo, and in addition to being a physician, he is a prolific, truly prolific writer in America and in Pakistan. He's published over 500 newspaper and magazine articles. I think we too are very privileged that he is with us today. Sitting next to Dr. Hussain is Dr. John Lentz. I smile because I have to introduce him as a doctor, even though we were college roommates. And so it's mutual assured deterrence. We know each other's dirty little secrets. I have none. He has many.
All right.
In real life, though, Dr. Lentz is a Presbyterian pastor here in Cleveland, and we actually have done some work together in this field of religion and terrorism, and it is truly a pleasure that you too have joined us. Next to Dr. Lentz is Professor Greg McNeal, who graduated from here a year ago. He is today the Assistant Director of the Institute for Global Security. In the past year has written a tremendous amount in this field. He will be leaving us at the end of this year. He's off to Penn State. And finally, Professor Michel Rosenfeld from Yeshiva University, Cardozo School of Law, the Sidney L. Robbins Professor of Human Rights, also a very, very prolific writer and a very important person in this field. Dr. Hussain, we'll start with you.
Yes.
The way we're going to do it, here are the ground rules. Each speaker will be given no more than 15 minutes for their comments in response to questions and answers, and then a free-for-all. Sir.
Thank you. Sorry, don't worry. It's okay. It's fine. No problem.
It always seems to happen and I know the clock is ticking, but perhaps you can put it on the just stop the stopwatch, if you please. And here it is. Okay, here it is. I got it. Well, I'm most grateful to you for this wonderful seminar that you invited me to participate. My presentation is on PowerPoint, but when I got the invitation to come here, I was a bit intimidated to come to Case Law School. My intimidation was because of my chosen profession of being a surgeon. The medical profession thinks that the the sole reason for the existence of law schools is to produce graduates whose only purpose in life is to harass doctors. So with that intimidation I came, but I had one solace, and that was that I retired 3 years ago from the practice of surgery, and hence I'm immune to any lawsuits. But seriously, I'm very grateful for this opportunity. Last night I was in a distinguished company, and they were sort of curious, what the hell is surgeon doing here in this elite, very distinguished body? And so I had to somehow convince them that I have a few things to say. And it was a great evening last night, and I enjoyed that myself. Let me tell you that the topic of this symposium is sacred violence and religiously based terrorism. And in current currency, sacred violence means Islamic violence. Let's face it. I mean, this morning we had some euphemisms and here and there. Let's talk about Islamic violence. And that usually brings up the question, once the premise is made, as what is the logical next aspect? Why does Quran, the sacred text of Muslims, teach violence? It's almost like asking, when did you stop beating your wife? I mean, you have already accepted a premise, and now the discussion is beyond that premise. And the reason for that is that this premise is catchy, is sexy, and satisfied superficial generalization. Now, it reminds me of George Orwell, who says, as soon as certain topics are raised, concrete melts into the abstract, and no one seems to think of turns of speech that are not hackneyed. Prose consists less and less of words chosen for the sake of their meaning, and more of the phrases tacked together like the sections of a prefabricated henhouse. I borrow a topic from a distinguished speaker this morning, Dr. Pervez Ahmed, who said unholy violence. Well, that's the premise of my talk, unholy violence in the name of religion, and perhaps a battlefield in the kingdom of God. My presentation will not follow the title which has been proposed for this. Instead, I will raise 3 questions. One is, does the Quran, and it has been touched upon this morning, does the Quran, the sacred text of Muslims, teach violence against non-Muslims and others? My second question is, has there ever been a real accommodation by Muslims with other religions in history? And the third is, of course, what can we do about it, the religiously inspired violence? This was also mentioned this morning, that religiously inspired violence is nothing new. It has been with us. The zealots of Judea, Hashashins, which are the Ismaili Shias, the Crusades, and we heard a lot about this morning about this Japanese religious cult sect, which has caused the problem. When we talk about the text, any text, and it's true of the Muslim sacred text, is that what is the text and what is the context? There are passages in the Old Testament which, taken out of context, would really scare the whatever out of us. Here is one passage from the Holy Book. It says, and slay them wherever you catch them. And this is the battle cry in some mosques and by some people. Well, where did it come from? Fight in the cause of Allah, please read God, who fight you but do not transgress limits, and slay them wherever you catch them, and turn them out from where they have turned you out, for tumult and oppression is worse than slaughter. And fight them not at the sacred mosque, blah, 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 blah. Now, what's the context? Is that verse applicable 1400 years before, until this time, and until eternity? No. there was a violation of a treaty of Hudaybiyah. What is Hudaybiyah? A small town outside Mecca. Why it came about? The Prophet was living in Medina. He came for pilgrimage with his companions. They were not allowed to enter Mecca. And there was a confrontation. And after the confrontation, they sat down, they talked, and they entered into a treaty. The next year, when the Muslims come, they will be allowed to do the pilgrimage, but not that year. The Prophet's companions were angry with him for succumbing, agreeing to that. And when there was the violation of the Treaty of Hudaybiyah by the Meccans, then that verse came and that was applicable for that time. So the question arises, what does the sacred text say about who are non-Muslims? We talk about the infidels and we talk about all those things. I want to share a few slides with you as to really what the text says. Here is one. It says, treat with respect those who have been good to you, even though they may belong to a different faith, in the Quran. This day, all things good and pure made for you have been made for you lawful. The food of the people of the book, that means the Christian and the Jews. And I consider some other religions as well. But I'm in the minority group considering that. People of the book is made lawful. That if anyone slew a person unjustly, it would be as if he slew the whole people. And do not dispute with the people of the book except with means that are kind, gentle, and polite. And in their footsteps we sent Jesus, the son of Mary, confirming the law that had come before him, and we sent him the Gospels. Therein was the guidance and light and confirmation of the law. Let there be no compulsion in religion. Truth stands out clear from error. Whoever rejects evil and believes in Allah, again, read God, has grasped the most trustworthy handhold that ever never breaks. And God hears and knows all things. Say, O Muslims, that we believe in God and the revelations given to us and to Abraham, Ishmael, Isaac, Jacob, and the descendants of Jacob, and that given to Moses and Jesus, and that given to all prophets from their Lord. We make no difference between one and another of them, and we bow to God. Having set the basis for relationship between different faiths, who is then entitled to enter the gated celestial community we call heaven? Is only the Muslims who are going there? Christians, Jews, who? And there is another passage which is very interesting. Is salvation only for Muslims? Those who believe in Quran and those who believe in the Jewish scriptures and the Christian Sabians and who believes in God and the last day of judgment and work righteousness shall have their reward with their Lord. I don't think there can be anything more clearer than what it is. And also there is a very clear passage about the protecting the places of worship. I'm saying all these things that you can put in context as to what is happening today and that cacophony of rhetoric which is coming from different parts of the Middle East and the world about the people who don't believe in what they believe in. And again it says that monasteries and churches and synagogues and mosques should be protected. Let's go on to say what are the recurrent themes in the Holy Book. Truthfulness, to be just and fair, to be righteous, to good deeds, to be polite and kind, and no compulsion on religion. And even if there were passages which are violent, like some in the Old Testament, and there was no context, I think we have to apply the law of preponderance to see what are the overwhelming evidence what is in the book as compared to the few of the passages. And the question arises, so have Islam cooperated with other faiths in the past? The golden age of Islamic civilization, historic convergences, we saw that in Abbasids, in Fatimids, Umayyads, and the Mughals in India. It happened. It was the convergence of all those faiths that brought that together. No, I'll take a minute to explain. This morning, Professor Ahmed talked about ijtihad, which is the interpretation of the sacred text according to prevailing times. And because if we don't have the time for me to dwell on it, it's only that thing is that religion, to me, is a dynamic entity. It is not static. It is not static, frozen in time, 600, 800, 1,000 years old. It is still open to interpretation and dynamism. The Quran gives us that tool of ijtihad. We have not used it for over 1,000 years. And hence, the saga of a dry ink wells, there is a saying of the Prophet that the ink from the pen of a scholar is more sacred than the blood of a martyr. And hence my saying that the saga of a dry ink wells. I think that is something we do recognize. So here we are, all of us conversing with each other, but in an echo chamber. And I quoted this Arthur Conan Doyle, The Empty House, that, "Ah, my dear Watson, here we come to the realm of conjecture where the most logical mind be at fault. Each may form his own hypothesis upon the present evidence, and yours is as likely to be correct as mine." And that only happens when we talk to each other, not to each other, but we talk past each other. And I think that's what's happening. I listened to a presentation this morning, and I was struck by the narrow focus of those presentations. Actually, I was flabbergasted, or I should say, my flabber was gasted by having such a narrow focus. I would like to look at things a little bit more openly and broadly. So, what are the remedies? There are some things we ought not to do. Address the root causes. It's been talked about. Improving the plight of disenfranchised and the poor, and the role of American Muslims. And I'll hurry through it. The minefields. Which are the minefields? Demands for a drastic reinterpretation of sacred text. Change the Quran. This is what we are hearing. No. Changing interpretation according to what we think has to be. No. The Afghan experiment has been talked about, that religion was used to marshal support against the Soviets. Now the religion is discredited, the same religion. And the West has the answer to everything. And in My Fair Lady, Professor Higgins tells Eliza Doolittle, "Why can't the women be like men?" Same play. "Why can't you be like me?" And I think it's because we try to impose what we believe is right on other people. Approaches not to take, the rhetoric of arrogance. That's offensive to people around the world. Practical approaches. And I'm down to my 2 slides. Promoting education, addressing poverty, addressing outstanding political issues. It's been talked about in roundabout ways this morning, but I will give you the list. A partnership with moderate Muslims. That is lacking in this country. Interfaith dialogue. It is lacking to a greater extent because we hold hands and say we are brothers and we accept each other, but when we go back to our places of worship, we talk about the superiority of our own faiths. You can't be superior and equal at the same time. We have to accept each other by not believing as to other belief. And we have not done that. Public repudiation of hate mongers. We have to stand up and say to the Franklin Grahams and the General Boykins that this is not the rhetoric which America stands for. If I am asked to say out loud anything which is said about Christianity, against Christianity and Judaism, I expect those people to say the same thing about Islam. Islam is not a monolith. I'm different than the person who is wielding a hand grenade in the Middle East. So don't lump me together. So that's my request is you have to stand up and be counted as well. What is the laundry list? Everybody knows. A post-colonial laundry list. Palestine, Kashmir, Chechnya, Balkans, you name it. And they're all there. They're problems. They have to be tackled. You cannot isolate them and say, no, let's talk about terrorism. And there's no. We have to connect the dots. Unless we connect the dots, all those things will remain and fester. Role of American Muslims. I think that is an untapped reservoir which have not been used. American Muslims have to condemn terrorism in loud, clear, and unambiguous voice. They have to distance themselves from the right-wing fanatics in their own faith. Reform and educate, very important. Same voice in private and public, and find partners in other faiths. And since I'm a surgeon, since I was a surgeon, okay. So I'll conclude by answering those three questions. Does Quran condone violence against non-Muslims? The answer is no. Has there ever been a real accommodation by Muslims with other religions? Yes, many times in history. What can be done about religiously inspired violence? A multi-pronged approach that also addresses outstanding political issues. And I thank you very much.
You're up, buddy.
Great. Let's see. First of all, let me thank Amos and Greg and everyone else who's involved in putting together this conference, and especially the students who I know have worked so exceptionally hard, and the staff that's been assisting them. This has been a terrific experience, and already I feel like I've benefited so much from being here, so thank you very much. And I understand Cleveland is like this year-round. Is that correct? It's fantastic. The tribe's going to win it all this year. I know it. I figured I couldn't go wrong with that unless I accidentally said the wrong team name. Thank you, Detroit. So a little bit of levity. Now back to a more serious topic. Our marching orders really are to answer the question of, well, what is to be done in light of what we've been talking about all day? Take it to the practical level is how I understand that. And being a law professor, to me that means taking it to the level of what legal changes may be appropriate or not appropriate in light of what we've been talking about. I rush to add that I certainly do not think that this is just a legal question. It's entirely correct what Bruce said earlier about the need for a full spectrum approach to the problem we're dealing with here. And he was talking in terms of focusing not just on military efforts, but also on law enforcement, economic, diplomatic, and educational efforts and so forth. But the same thing is sort of true in terms of the various mechanisms by which we pursue those. Legal approaches characterized by military detention, legal approaches characterized by criminal justice models, immigration models. There's a variety there as well. And just as in the larger policy context, so too in the legal context, you need to adopt the appropriate model for the appropriate circumstance, and it's not monolithic, to borrow the doctor's phrase. It's not a one-size-fits-all model. We need to figure out where the right place and the right circumstances are for applying each of these models. So having said all that, let me first touch on some of the themes that stood out to me from a law professor's point of view from this morning, and why I think they inform part of our discussion of the legal piece of this puzzle. Some of the most prominent themes in these morning panels had to do with definitional difficulties and the categorical problems we have. We so like to have categories and boxes we can drop our problems into. That's how we're taught. That's how we solve problems. And the real world so often doesn't comply with that. And we've certainly gotten a strong taste of that here today. The definitional difficulties associated with what is terrorism are well known. With what is religion, that's well known too. Fortunately, when you turn your attention to the legal implementation of policy, you can, to a certain extent, avoid those difficulties. Let me explain what I mean by this. For the international law folks in the room, you'll be very familiar with the fact that certainly on the international plane, we've never agreed at the UN level on a definition of terrorism. But that doesn't mean that the international communities never come to agreement on how to enact treaties that call for the criminalization of certain conduct that relates to terrorism. The solution has always been in the past to focus on conduct rather than motivations. So you get treaties that focus on hijackings or protection of diplomatic personnel, and they've grown. They're still incomplete, but these treaties have proliferated over time. None require any showing in court or any kind of definitional agreement on what the meaning of terrorism is. They focus on the conduct, the particular violent conduct that we can at least all agree we want to suppress that conduct, whatever the motivations may be, religious, ideological, or monetary for that matter. So whatever the motivation is, you can criminalize it. So too in our domestic criminal law. There is, as we've heard this morning, there are a number of statutes and regulations policy memoranda that adopt all these different definitions of terrorism. But from the point of view of an assistant United States attorney prosecuting or considering prosecuting a terrorism case, you don't necessarily need to get into that morass. What you need to do is figure out which box of conduct you can drop alleged or anticipated conduct into. And that circumvents, to a certain degree, all the problems. And of course, I'm sort of playing games by taking my line of inquiry out of the theme of our conference by saying essentially, well, I don't know, the role of religion in terrorism is very difficult from the legal point of view. We don't necessarily have to solve that puzzle, which is not at all to say that from the larger and overarching policy point of view that we don't need to engage it. We absolutely do. I just think the place where I can add value is drawing attention to these practical distinctions. So let me talk a little bit about the criminal justice model. And again, I want to preface this by saying that by focusing on criminal justice, I do not mean to suggest that military modes of response are inappropriate or to suggest when they are and when they aren't. I'll say a little bit about that at the end. But I want to shed light first on the criminal justice mechanisms as they currently stand, in case we want to have some Q&A about whether we want to alter that, whether it's good or bad. I think the critical point to convey with substantive criminal law is that since 9/11, famously both in the investigative phase and the prosecutorial phase, we've shifted our focus from post hoc investigation and prosecution to ex ante prevention. That's characteristic of most of the components of counterterrorism policy. It's certainly true in the Justice Department. The interesting thing about that, I'll talk separately about substantive criminal laws, what conduct is forbidden, and I'll talk a little bit about investigations. The interesting thing about it on the substantive side is this did not actually require anything in the way of new legislation. There have been a few new federal criminal statutes added to Title 18 that are preventive in nature, but these are tweaks to a pre-existing body of law that we've had in the books at least since the 1990s. The key elements to being able to intervene preventively with the criminal prosecution are, one is very familiar and very old, one is relatively new, both predate 9/11. The old one is conspiracy liability, of course. It's well understood and widely appreciated. This is a powerful tool in the hand of prosecutors to intervene ex ante if necessary or when it's possible to do so. And I can go into the details in the Q&A if we're interested in the ways that conspiracy liability can be used to push the boundaries on the spectrum between perhaps inclination or inspiration to possibly at some point in the future commit a harmful act in the actual commission of the act. Conspiracy liability lets you get very far along towards the early end of that, raising issues that some have characterized as the minority report problem, the notion that we may be intervening in some cases so early that what we're in effect doing is prosecuting folks for their tendency or ideas, when in fact we don't know for sure that they would ever act that way, thus raising issues of whether you've struck the right balance between the benefits of harm prevention and the harms of surely an increased rate of false positives in your prosecutorial patterns. Let me also mention a newer tool that we have in several guises, but it's largely from the 1990s, the material support concept. And this is something that those who follow post-9/11 prosecutions know is sort of the centerpiece of post-9/11 prosecutorial policy, a pair of statutes. In 1994, a statute codified at 18 U.S. Code 2339A criminalized the knowing or intentional provision of material support in furtherance or facilitation of a range of several dozen predicate violent acts, several of which were conspiracies. So this is sort of the notion at the Paradigm case, donating money, for example, to folks that you know are going to use that money to construct a bomb, night vision goggles, equipment, but also services, personnel, including the provision of one's own self as personnel. As I describe these terms, I hope you can sense how a creative use of this terminology can be used to reach very far back and early into that continuum I described between when you have someone who's potentially dangerous and someone who's actually acting dangerous or has already acted dangerous. In 1996, there was a second material support statute enacted. This one's 2339B. This one is different and more sweeping in some respects. One can only violate this 1996 statute by providing material support to a designated foreign terrorist organization. And there was some talk earlier today about the FTO process. the difference between the earlier material support statute and the newer one is not just that the newer one only applies to these designated foreign terrorist groups, the groups that the Secretary of State has formally identified as such. It's that you don't have to know or intend to facilitate any particular violent act or any harmful act or indeed the unlawful ends of the organization. It is sufficient that you knew who you were giving it to. So I want you to think of this concept, the 1996 statute, as essentially an embargo statute. It essentially enables an embargo to be placed on a group that the Secretary of State puts on the list. Even though it's not a state, it's a transnational actor or a sub-state actor, it's embargoed. Now, these two tools have been used and have enabled the DOJ to intervene in some very early circumstances, some circumstances where there's a lot of debate about whether or not the individual who was prosecuted successfully ultimately would have gone on to cause harmful acts. And there are a number of high-profile cases we could talk about if you're interested. Let me just note briefly that, of course, we've seen similar shifts on the investigative side. These have come through statute. They've come through policy change within DOJ. On the statutory side, of course, there's the Patriot Act, which in numerous ways enables the FBI and other agencies to have greater freedom of action in their investigations. There's also the revisions to the Attorney General guidelines, which are absolutely critical. These are internal DOJ regulations that were loosened in 2002 and then again in 2003 with respect to intelligence investigations. The upshot of it all is that there are a couple of problems in the investigative side that were perceived to be in place and that were described as such by the 9/11 Commission, including the inability or the perceived inability of agencies to share information, and also the inability or the perceived inability to use information gained from Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act warrants to share that information around. Those barriers have been lifted, and as I think many people in the room appreciate, there's also been a blowback to these restraints being lifted from the privacy rights community, so this is all very controversial. Now, given what I've just said about the expanded investigative powers of criminal investigators and the expanded prosecutorial powers that are available, why do we need a military detention option? I just want to comment, without meaning to say that it is in any particular circumstance the right path or the wrong path to go the military detention route, I want to note two practical reasons why the criminal justice model, even with the changes I've described, is not necessarily going to be a sufficient alternative in every instance. One has to do with the rules of evidence, simply put. Criminal prosecutions require evidence that's admissible pursuant to the federal rules of evidence, of course, that Greg and I both teach, and maybe some of you do as well. We have very high standards, and rightly so. They are a finely tuned inheritance from our common law tradition, and there's a lot of material that would be considered highly relevant and important to the security community, the intelligence community, that would be actionable from the point of view of the military or the intelligence community that could never be admitted in a court of law because of the rules of evidence. So you can easily imagine situations, and situations do arise, where we have information that's credible and trustworthy that, for example, an allied intelligence service has shared with us on conditions, including conditions that they can't be used in a court of law publicly. There's other information that comes from sources that would be hearsay and so forth. Problems like that are one practical reason why, for example, in the prosecution of Jose Padilla, or I guess it's back to Padilla now, it's changed a couple times. It's back to Padilla now in the Southern District of Florida. None of the indictment touches on the alleged dirty bomb or apartment bombing plots. Most of what we know about why the government believed those plots to be real, we know came from interrogations of captured al-Qaeda members whose statements, whatever value they may have had for intelligence purposes, wouldn't possibly be admissible in court. There was no way they could indict on that basis. There's no surprise in the fact that he wasn't indicted on that ground. The other thing to mention briefly is the problem of arrests and extradition. It's wonderful if you can arrest someone and extradite them to the United States and begin a criminal process. And we do continue to do this to this day. The British are on the verge of extraditing a couple of very significant defendants in criminal cases to us. The Dutch have done it as well in recent months. But not everyone's subject to arrest and extradition, and I think the pre-9/11 status quo in Afghanistan and perhaps the current status quo along the lawless border that Bruce mentioned earlier, are a sufficient illustration of that fact. So it makes us feel good, I think, to say, look, the criminal justice model is expansive and can do the job, and in the right circumstances it can, and in the right circumstances DOJ continues to use it frequently. And I've got data if you'd like to talk about that later on. But it's not always the right circumstance. It's not always a plausible option. Okay, so I'll stop my remarks there. Thank you very much.
How about if I go at the end? All right.
Sure. Will people just stand up and sit down again? That's something that pastors do well.
Does that have a religious meaning or not?
It makes me feel better. You know, starting a new movement here. That's right. Well, I'm very grateful to be here and certainly impressed by all the papers this morning and into the afternoon. And I was grateful for Professor Solomon's use of Kierkegaard about the awe and dread, because I really am in awe of these great scholars and policymakers who are working awfully hard, and sort of in dread to try to follow them in any particular way, because I'm a fish out of water, not being an academic or policymaker. I am a pastor. And the only clergy person on this panel, I see one brother up there in the back row, peace. And I wear and I bear, I feel the burden of some sense that I'm trying to confess, to get off my shoulders, of being a Christian, and a Presbyterian Christian from a liberal slant of the faith. And so I'm one of those who kind of likes campfires and marshmallows and kumbaya. So now that we got that. But I do have an advantage over most of you today, and my colleagues, because like those of whatever tradition who wrap themselves in the garb of religious language to perpetuate terror, I, like them, seek to study and to apply sacred texts to a modern world. And my study and application is not just for me alone. My call, my job, what I get paid to do is to help shape a community of faith. I really do believe that my tradition is transformative in people's lives, and that's what I seek to do every Sunday and every day when I go visit people in hospitals and pray with them, and when I have people come to talk about concerns on their heart. So there's a weight to that that I feel because I circle the sacred text and try to make meaning out of it. I struggle within the Christian context of a variety of Christian groups and people struggling to get meaning out of the Christian text. And I'll give you an example that happened last Monday night. Our group of Presbyterians were meeting to talk about the inclusion of gay and lesbian people into ordination in the church. Well, I have a particular take on that, and which is rather welcoming and liberal, and in the minority group, and I've been called Antichrist for it. And I kind of wear that as a badge of honor, actually. But the point is, even within the community of Christians, the idea of struggling for interpretive leverage of texts is very much in my mind and heart, and I think it's very important for us to consider that in the largest context, in this collaborative approach, in this multidisciplinary kind of setup that we have here today. So I'm an insider. I come back to saying I'm an insider in this, trained in the scholarly historic critical method, but an insider nevertheless that deals with texts and tries to change people's lives to follow them as I interpret them. I could not be more horrified, of course, than people of faith, in my opinion, who misuse the sacred texts. And there's not only that going on in Islam, but certainly in Christianity. And as the gentleman over here said, with the Roman Catholic Church, I don't mean to throw any stones at my sisters and brothers from the Roman tradition, because we have plenty of them in the Protestant tradition too, of systematic violence and using of texts in order to marginalize people and then to use violence against them. But I sort of get the methodology of looking at texts and being shaped by them. So I guess my point from listening to the papers today, certainly governments have to do what they have to do, which I guess is protect and defend their citizens, and engage in both diplomacy and military action. I get that, against foreign nations and sort of sub-non-national entities like Al-Qaeda. And I certainly understand and get why scholars have to share idea and be very, very critical as we seek a deeper truth about these things. But at heart, well, maybe not at heart, but certainly as we've learned today, a significant part of this issue is a religious one. And we can seek, like my brothers of the Muslim faith, and as I seek to do in my Christian faith, we're going to struggle to claim the texts that we know to be true that shape our understanding of an inclusive, welcoming, hospitable faith. But we're not the only ones engaged in this process. So we have to be very savvy about the religious aspect of this, and that we're dealing with sacred texts that give some people justification to do very dastardly things. And so we do have a problem with definitions like terrorism and religion, but a definition of religion that I have found useful, and I want to tip my hat to my friend Professor Tim Beal, who's in the audience, is that there's a sort of a dueling undercurrent in the word religion. Is it based on sort of the key root ligament which ties us together, binds us together in a tradition, or in the Latin word religare, which means to reread the text. So we are in the process in religion of rereading texts, rereading traditions, and being bound together through religious rites and things like that. So however we respond to sacred terror, we do have to be aware of how communities bind themselves together and how they reread and reinterpret their sacred scripture and engage them on that level. And so in our struggle to claim our texts and to adequately interpret them and relate them to our congregations, I think we can be critical both of the terrorists who misuse them, but also critical of perhaps even our own government who uses theological language and biblical undergirding for our own foreign policy. So I think the practitioner, we have the pulpit, and it's an amazing, powerful place to be where we can both engage people on self-critical analysis, criticism of the tradition, as well as the larger culture. So I think we need to be we've got to have some careful analysis of several indices that I think to speak of this multidisciplinary approach. We are aware of, Jerry talked about it a little bit this morning, of the indice of sort of power versus powerlessness, and how communities relate both to their local and global communities. I think it's important to be aware of how groups see themselves on the marginality scale, I will call it. I mean, are they really of central importance in their community, or see themselves sort of marginalized by the larger world? But I also think we're missing something if we don't put a lot of emphasis on trying to understand a group's hermeneutical approaches to texts. How do we read text and interpret them? I think that's fundamental. I don't think there's nearly enough work being done on that and enough engagement between communities of faith around sacred texts, trying to interpret and get to understand how do we read this stuff and how does it move us? And I think that would help us not only know our enemies, but at least in the Christian tradition, we are to love our enemies and pray for those who persecute us. So I think in the engagements with those we call enemy, we can't just go in and say, oh, look, they're wrong, they're misusing text, they're twisting it. Well, they think I'm twisting my text, but we've got to do the work around do we understand how we're using each other's texts. So as a practitioner, to much of the world, really an irrelevant player, shaping community around impractical things like love of neighbor and turn the other cheek and returning no evil for evil, I shall throw in some impractical advice. I do think we need more people trained to have conversation on religious issues and matters of scriptural interpretation if we're going to diffuse anything. My one example is Charles Kimball, the author of a fairly popular book, When Religion Becomes Evil, was one of two clergy persons. He's a Baptist by background, one of two clergies who actually studied the Quran in the Islamic religious tradition, and he was one of the two who was received by the Iranians in December 1979 in the midst of the hostage crisis. So let's remember that. If it's a religious conversation we got to have, send people who know religion. Secondly, Stanley Hauerwas, who's a a fiery ethicist and biblical scholar out of Duke, and he travels all over. I've always been struck. In some ways, I understand the impracticality of this to its extreme. On the other hand, he's onto something. He was commenting upon what would be a proper religious, faithful response to the Libya bombing of many years ago. And he said, well, I'm a Methodist, and you know, Methodists have always done well sending missionaries. He says, now I'm not saying we send 1,000 missionaries to kind of convert. No. But we send 1,000 folks who are grounded in the tradition of peaceful witness, of nonviolent witness, and saying, this is not how we treat one another, and we're going to stand up and be accounted, and we're going to make a witness to the world of another way of looking at issues and dealing with them and responding to people. Because he said, and this has always struck me, there are many things that people of faith should die for, but they're probably nothing that we should kill for. And that's something that shapes my ethic and my work in my community, and I think just to be remember that when we get into policy conversations. So I believe, and I guess when you're a religious practitioner, it always comes down to faith at some matter. We should shape our policy response by the Hebrew prophet Micah, who once said, what does the Lord require of you? But to do justice, and to love kindness, and to walk with humility before your God. And by justice, I mean what Walter Brueggemann describes as find out what belongs to whom and give it back to them. I think it's a fascinating and very powerful foundation for actually practical politics. I think we always are undergirded by civility and kindness. Civility and kindness. And the third piece is humility. And that is what is such rarely talked about, both in our presumption of righteous authority from our side and what we are hearing from the other side about their understanding that God has blessed them. So engage interfaith conversation. I think only in that, I really agree with you, we must have these conversations as part of the formula of diffusing sort of the outer fringe base. We're not going to talk the hardened core terrorist at the beginning, at the center of a movement, talk him out of his understanding. But I do think we have tremendous ability to have impact on the fringe folk who are sort of moving along. And I think with humility and direct conversation about the hermeneutical principle of how we understand and interpret texts, I think that would have tremendous impact on engaging in a positive way. Thanks.
I approach these things from somewhat of a unique perspective, I guess. My research is just getting started on sort of my research agenda, and what I'm finding is that the things that I've worked on have dealt with the not-so-cheery topics of what governments do to their own people using the implements of military force. For example, the trial of Saddam Hussein was one of my areas of research and scholarship, and then the other is this area of counterterrorism, what civilians do with the implements of warfare to governments. And it's sort of this interesting, they're not really mirror images of each other, but you can make them sound that way for a panel. What's really interesting to me and a recurring theme is every time I go to a workshop and we discuss these things, we talk about the interdisciplinary nature of things, and we also talk about how there's always these failures in policy implementation because what we as policymakers or in the United States try to do when we're dealing in a globalized world, we fail to recognize or understand the systems in place where we're trying to affect change. Granted, we can't fix a lot of the problems that we know about even with our own borders, and we understand our own systems. So think then how much more complicated these issues are when you go abroad. That's why I think it's so critical to be a part of a panel like this, and certainly it's a lot of credit to Amos for constantly having, whenever we have a conference like this, it's an interdisciplinary one. It's never just a group of law professors. And I think all of us sat here today and learned so much from people from varied backgrounds, religion, psychology, and whatnot. And first lesson learned, I treated this sort of as a lessons learned panel. The first lessons learned, I think, is when you go forward to build a policy implementation group to solve these problems, what Dr. Hoffman was suggesting is really resonates with me, that you need to have individuals from varied backgrounds who all have an equal seat at the table. And I think without it, we'll continue to have this sort of policy myopia. And I wanted to highlight some examples just from my own research about this level of policy myopia and what it's impacted. First was the global war on terrorism. Bobby stole some of my thunder talking about some of the things I would talk about.
It's good to go first.
So I'll head down a different path, which is that it's true that we can kill and capture as many of the enemy as we want, whoever we define the enemy as. We can try them in Guantanamo Bay, and we can declare that a victory without really knowing what the parameters of a victory are. However, what we'll really find is that despite our ability to annihilate them, our ability to interdict them and arrest them, the example of the number 2 or number 1 al-Qaeda man in Iraq is a great example. It makes great news headlines when you say that we took out the number 2 or number 1 guy in Iraq, al-Qaeda guy in Iraq. But the next day, someone else steps up to the table and takes over that leadership role. I'm sure it's not a job that the guy really wants, sitting around a table saying, oh, no, you can be number 1, you can be number 1, because you know that missile's coming down the pipe. But clearly that's indicative of something. It's the resilience of the organization, and it demonstrates that while the military component is a necessary component of what we're doing, there has to be something else. That's something else, though, and I guess the frustrating thing to a lot of us who do this is that we like to think of, how can I craft a solution? My graduate work is in public policy and administration, and then I have this legal background. So I'm like, we either need a legal framework or a government structure or bureaucracy. If we could just put those things together, we're going to have some kind of solution for it. And I suppose if I had the answer for that, I'd probably be doing something else and making a lot of money doing it, because I'd be a pretty smart guy. So I think that's the first example that highlights a challenge for me. But then the second thing I wanted to say is that the international community is actually no better at this than we are in the United States. Perfect example, I was at a workshop on transitional justice. Transitional justice is this notion that when you go to, you take post-conflict states where horrible things are happening to people. Usually we'll define those people as other people sometimes, because these horrible things don't happen in our countries. And then atrocities have occurred, and it's time to work on the transitional justice issues. How can this country rebuild itself? So a bunch of international experts get together and they say, we're going to have a court, and we're going to try the dictator who did all of these bad things to that person, right? And we come in and we build a mega court, a UN court. It costs $500 million to run the thing. And you try 23 people for $500 million, and down the road is the exact same court system that was operating before. It doesn't have the air conditioning. It doesn't have a court management and file system. And then we say to ourselves, we have this notion of transitional justice, but I can't figure out why they just won't understand what's going on with this. Why won't they make their court system like our court system? And part of it is this is the inability on the policymakers to realize that you're going to another country that has a different system, that has a different belief system, and again, it's the lack of the interdisciplinary nature of things. In Iraq, there was a good example with the Iraqi High Tribunal statute, which was it's local justice, right? That was the purpose of the Iraqi tribunal. And we implemented local justice by writing the statute for the Iraqi High Tribunal in English, translating it into Arabic, and then telling the Iraqis that the official version of this will be the English version. So imagine that. You go to another country, you say, your official local court system is good. The official statute is going to be governed by the English language version, not the Arabic language version. And again, the belief that if you just stood up a trial, it would be okay. So Saddam gets a year-long trial for his crimes, and then down the street, people are getting 20-minute trials and sentenced to death with no rights. And I think the point that it highlights is that when you try to just create something from a legal framework, or just try to create it from a public administrative standpoint, without putting together all the components, as Bruce was suggesting before, the policy implementation phase fails. So I'm highlighting a lot of the problems, and I think that the point of these examples is that there's more questions than there are answers to this. So I was trying to wrap my arms around a concrete example that we could work with. And the one that troubled me the most was the example of Omar Khadr, who is a detainee in Guantanamo. Omar Khadr was picked up on the battlefield in Afghanistan at the age of 16 when he was engaged in active hostilities against the United States. Special Forces soldiers went to what was believed to be an al-Qaeda safe house and engaged in direct fire combat with the individuals inside that safe house. They went into the building after the gunfire stopped. One of the Special Forces medics begins tending to one of the injured al-Qaeda individuals inside, and out pops Omar Khadr, 16 years old, who fires on the medic, killing him, and then fires on another and blinds him. He's subsequently detained and sent to Guantanamo along with his brother. And what we find out in the course of interrogations and then public statements made by Khadr's brother from the results of a civil case for money damages regarding the wounded soldiers sued essentially the estate of the Khadr family. What we find out is that Omar Khadr, as bad a person as we might think he is, and I'm not defending him, since the age of 8, grew up in al-Qaeda training camps. His family, if you go on the internet, you can Google this Canadian broadcasting company special on the Khadr family, where they say we are an al-Qaeda family. We had spent holidays with the bin Ladens. So I bring this example up because if you want to, there's this talk about winning the hearts and minds and whatnot. I don't know what policy prescription you could bring about to change the example of someone who murder is wrong, right? We can agree on that. But if you were brought up since 8 that murder against the infidel pig is not wrong, murder against these individuals is not wrong, and this type of war is correct, how could you ever stop that type of conduct from occurring? And I think the answer is that we won't ever get there. We have to accept that type of conduct is probably always going to be out there. So that can't be our goal to try to solve that. That can't be the definition of winning, is solving that problem, because I don't think we'll ever get to that point. But it has to be some sort of metric short of that, which perhaps, as Bruce is suggesting, is when does this challenge cease to be a strategic problem and it just becomes a problem that we can manage day to day, when it ceases to be one that dominates our discussions of our strategic goals. Thank you.
Thank you. I will follow the orders, which I thought it was to comment on the morning speakers and maybe expand a little bit on some of the things. I will only comment on 2 of the speakers. I found the others very interesting, but they don't relate really to my field. So it'll be Professor Barris and Professor Ahmed. And let me say that I found Professor Ahmed too optimistic and Professor Barris unduly pessimistic, and let me try to explain what I have in mind. Let me start by, we've been discussing, one thing is, and this is an ongoing debate, I hope you take it with equanimity, that I have with political scientists, and I like political scientists. I'm teaching a seminar with 2 of them this semester, but they believe that the law is clear and it solves everything. So we know the law, and whatever is contested is outside the law. I don't have to tell the law professor, certainly, but hopefully not even the law students. The main issues in law are always contested and not so clear-cut. And certainly what international law prescribes in these circumstances that you were discussing is not clear, and it's contested among judges and top scholars and so forth. But the point I want to start with religion. We've heard a lot of things about religion. I found the remarks of Professor Reverend Dr. Lentz.
I've been promoted. Or demoted.
I think you've been demoted, and I apologize. Inspiring, but we're talking about 2 different things here. First of all, I do share one thing with you. I also do hermeneutics, and I also spend most of my life, I'm a constitutional law professor, looking at a religious text, or one that at least thinks itself to be a religious text. And we all know the differences there are between a liberal view. There are no liberals now in the courts, I'll say Justice Brennan and Justice Scalia. They're both reading the same text, okay, and they present very different views of it. So religion is the same. Those are great religion with really complex texts, and there are many different interpretations of it. But let me take an example. When we're talking about religion, we're talking about, in effect, a sort of synthesis or symbiosis for political purposes of a claim to religious authority, then which is then combined with a political agenda, also which involves hatred of the other. And I will give an example not from Islam, but from Judaism. There was a rabbi in a West Bank settlement, one of these extreme rabbis, who was lecturing his group of students in what is called the Yeshiva, and who told, which is the Jewish version of a madrasa, and he was telling them that according to Holy Scripture, which means the Old Testament and all other Talmud, etc., that to kill a Gentile is not murder. Now, this rabbi making this speech at that particular place, at that particular time, led to a conviction in an Israeli civil court for incitement to hatred and to violence, and this man was given a 3-year sentence. So I think when I'm speaking of religion here, I'm speaking about this type of religion. So where I find Dr. Ahmed a little too optimistic is there are many, many of them in many countries that take Islam to prescribe hatred of the other, to prescribe murder of the other, and to lead to acts that are unspeakable. So in this sense, Islam is to be criticized. Today I think that Christianity is not doing the same things, but if you look at its history, for instance, I view the Inquisition. I know there was some very neat separation. The church condemned, and then the civil authorities burned. But that was quite as objectionable as what is going on today, too. And Judaism is not exempt either. Judaism was exempt for a long time because they had no power when they were in exile. But when they had the biblical times, there were wars and there are prescriptions to exterminate people in the Bible. So one interpretation is that kind of violence existed even in the Old Testament. All right. So the real issue for us in terms of religion and violence is, number one, to look at this political aspect of religion, and two, and this was raised already here too, is to try to correlate that. What does that have to do with religion? Why is there such a revival of religion today? And the revival of religion is, interestingly enough, and this is what leads to this clash of cultures, on both sides of the divide. It's something that happens in the United States and something that happens in the Islamic world. And it's been mentioned, it's no accident that Bush started with the language of the Crusades, and he sort of stepped back, but there's been a lot of showing, and also not only in the area of fighting against terrorism. If you look at a lot of the changes during the Bush administration have been run by the religious right. One example, which has nothing to do with the theme, but it shows how deep this is penetrated and is quite striking. I was at another conference on fundamentalism, and that was not about necessarily terrorism, but fundamentalism in politics. And a specialist in social working school was following the changes in sex education in junior high schools in the United States. And apparently the government is now instituting, which I didn't know, not having children that age, was instituting all over the place abstinence. Absolutely, that's the only way that you can. And then there was a very interesting film showing that sex was related to death. All of which is fine, except what is the result of all this? Because it's incongruous with the rest of our society. The result of all this apparently is that teenage pregnancy and venereal disease have jumped up tremendously. Whereas when people were taught about horrible things like just condoms, those things may have gone down a little bit. I raise this only to point out that this is not simply the question of the issue of terror, but we have this problem. Now, one philosopher, many philosophers have been mentioned today, so why not throw in one, and another one, also a lot of French philosophers, Jacques Derrida, who died recently, had an analysis of 9/11, and he basically said what I just said, which is that we have this new clash between civilizations, and America is turning more and more to religion. The only hope is Europe. I don't know if the only hope is Europe. But Europe is less religious than the United States. Now, I don't want to sound anti-religious. I'm not. I think religion has a very important role in any society. But perhaps one of the ways we should go is to have less religion in politics. We also need some kind of, in terms of law, and I know the standards in the United States are different than in the rest of the world, but there was a very strong, and this is throughout Europe, but in the case of Germany it's even more dramatic, a strong legal reaction after the end of the Third Reich, and that is to criminalize Nazi speech. And they go very far. There's a debate, Holocaust denial is a crime. Should it go that far? I don't know. But certainly criminalizing incitement to racial violence. If many of the Muslim countries where you see, for instance, the reaction after the Danish cartoons, which was extremely violent language against non-Muslims, and that's one example, many other examples, there doesn't seem to be any effort on the part of the government. I saw yesterday signs in Iraq which are frightening about the British soldiers. Maybe the British soldiers violated their I don't know, their territorial waters, but the kind of rhetoric that I saw on CNN by Iranians against not only the British but the West and et cetera, those are frightening, and they certainly do not lead to a better understanding or way to cool down the rhetoric. So that would be an interesting approach if we could try to limit the amount of hatred that is perpetrated. Let me turn to the other issue, which is the issue, and then maybe make a more general suggestion. The other issue, which is the issue of preemption, which you brought. Taken to its logical extreme, we get to the Reagan invasion of Grenada. I don't know if all of you remember this, but in 1985, all of a sudden, the United States invaded Grenada. There was, I think, unfortunately, one American death, friendly fire. And what was the justification? It was part of this dominus theory preemption that was prevailing there. In self-defense, the United States had to go to Grenada. What was found, first of all, there were some medical students who were interviewed by ABC and said, "Did you hear the president is evading because you're in danger?" I said, "What? In danger? We're having a wonderful time." That was one. Two, a cache of arms in a relationship with Castro. So they found, I think, a few discard rifles that even Castro couldn't use, which were hidden in some underground place. Obviously, I'm making light of this, but the point is that the logic, and one can get into this logic with tremendous, one step follows the other, and one magnifies things one after another, and then it seems like there's no end to it. This leads me to the point I want to make about terrorism in general, and that is that, and this has been discussed already, and that is that terrorism is not nothing, and I think in the presentation of Professor Hoffman, I think he gave a good answer when challenged on this point. On the other hand, it is not the Cold War. And I suggest to see the difference that you look at, there was a documentary on McNamara, which I thought was fascinating, where he indicated that it was perhaps within hours, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, that something could have started, and we wouldn't be here discussing this today if that would have started. That would have been mutual annihilation. The suggestions that 1 million or 3 million people would be wiped out in one terrorist act, the chances of that are extremely low. We have to look at probabilities. The idea of the dirty bomb, I read about the dirty bomb, it's not that easy to set off, it's very unlikely, but even let's say we get a dirty bomb in a city like New York or Chicago or Los Angeles, it wouldn't be Cleveland, don't worry. It would, I have to worry about it. And I they always say Wall Street, and I don't even work that far from Wall Street. Let's say it kills 100,000 people. It is an absolutely horrendous, unspeakable tragedy. It will not destroy the United States of America. And even 3 or 4 of these will not destroy the United States of America. I think the issue really is the fear that terrorism creates, and living in fear is very bad, and that therefore we should take it seriously. So what I suggest is that instead of getting into a crisis mode, the language of the war and terror, in this sense, incidentally, I listened to on a panel at a conference like this to an ex-CIA chief and an British, I don't know what it's called, the equivalent of the CIA. It was very interesting how they disagreed. And they disagreed in particular because the British says, we don't call it a war, and I think by calling it a war, you distort everything. And also, he says, then you're having, I guess that's more true from the British point of view, but you're having a war on yourself. You don't know where the terrorists come from. They may come from inside your society. They may come from outside. They're indistinct. But also, the whole mentality and the whole frenzy over the war on terror should be downplayed. And we should look at this, and I have drawn a distinction between what are called in times of crisis, times of emergency. And in times of emergency, there is such urgency. The country is under risk of losing either its independence or its existence. Constitutional rights can be suspended. We don't need habeas corpus. In the United States, we don't have an emergency constitution, but we have mechanisms in order to limit civil rights and so forth that's justified. In ordinary times, on the other hand, we have a totally different regime where all rights have to be enforced at all times. As a constitutionalist, it seems to me that the war on terror, as it's called anyhow, so I use the term because everybody uses it, requires some increased vigilance and perhaps some limitation, very limited but added limitations of civil rights. And I would call that in those circumstances we're living in times of stress, where the our existence as a polity is not threatened, but there is enough uncertainty, enough unease, and of course, if we imagine the worst scenario, we could have a disintegration of the type of society we are used to having, that we can make some exceptions, but there should be very few and far between. Now, the last point I want to make is the point about pluralism in general. One, which is a more theoretical point, but may lead to perhaps some policy and some legal reaction. It seems to me crucial. There's a story of the Enlightenment, which is, I think, that's one of the worst, from a Western point of view, one of the worst threats is the threat to what many people, anyhow, thrash, called the Enlightenment, which allowed for a certain secularism to set in, and which allowed for the good part of that, even if you're religious, is that it makes for religious pluralism. Unlike some of the people who have said we shouldn't tell ourselves, we can tell other people, but we shouldn't tell ourselves our religion is better. I disagree with that. I think that each religious community should tell itself, we are the best religion, that's why I belong to this religion. But the difference is this internal, intra-communal approach should not be a political approach. This is where the lesson of the Enlightenment is very important. And to say that as a political matter, as a right to a stake on society and so forth, we should be pluralistic. We should accept all religions that do not intend to harm others, and we should accept non-religious people, and we should, to preserve that, we need to be less religious in our public policy and less religious in our government. So we have to have a return to what was, at least before the Bush era in the United States. I think that, although I said I would be more pessimistic than some, I want to end on a note of optimism. Apparently the most recent survey shows a few things. One is less hostility towards atheists, somewhat down, I think, 5% in the United States. And I hope you'll forgive me, but I only take this in the good sense, slightly less attendance in churches. Maybe in the long run, I know that's not what we're looking for, and I'm all for churches and mosques and synagogues, but it's an idea that maybe the fact that a religion has become so politicized has started turning off some people, and if that's what this means, I think, then it's a good step forward. Thank you.
Here's what we're going to do. We're going to take a no more than 15-minute break.
You forgot your last one.
No, I'll tell you what, we're going to start with Bruce. It's all under control, believe me. 15-minute break. Come back at 3:30. The following is a short video clip from President Field addressing our mock White House task force. Take it away.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
Thank you for your discussion and analysis of religious extremism. I am committed to ensuring that any legislation passed respects civil liberties and human rights. Therefore, I ask that you explain what rights are in conflict. Also, please suggest how to address the threat to public safety while simultaneously respecting individual rights. I know collectively you represent a cross-section of lawyers, academics, and journalists. Your time, expertise, and analysis is appreciated. Thank you.
Mr. President.
Questions from the audience before we turn it over for the final policy discussion? Raise your hand. Need a microphone.
I don't necessarily expect that this is going to be answered very quickly, and I don't know if it applies to everything everyone said, but it's something that I've been thinking of throughout the conference today, which is this problem with defining authentic religion. Now, aside from the problem of determining hermeneutically what the most precise reading of a religious text is, there is this assumption or subtext that we have to go back to the primary originary text for something to be an authentic interpretation of religion. Now, by implication, that means that any deviation from that religion or further development, a new interpretation, which is a radical departure, makes it inauthentic. That's the assumption that I keep hearing. And if that's the case, then Christianity would be an inauthentic deviation from Judaism. Islam would be an inauthentic deviation from Christianity. Buddhism would be an inauthentic deviation from Hinduism and from Vedic thought. So what's not being said, because it's frightening in a way, is the possibility that even if it's a different reading of Islam and hermeneutically inaccurate, there might be some authenticity to the idea of somebody creating a new violent perspective on a religion. Otherwise, one has to go back and claim that our own evolution is also invalid.
Lentz?
I think. Can I answer a non-religious? Well, I'll give you time to think about the true answer. I would like to. I fully agree with you, and I think that what we have to do. I mean, it's the old Enlightenment thing, and modified to the postmodern age, which is quite a challenge. But it's the idea that what you do in your own religious community and how you interpret it is a matter for your own religious community, so long as you don't kill and don't prohibit others from practicing their own religion. This has nothing to do with the authentic religion. Every person can believe whatever version of these sacred texts is the right one. And if you put your finger, no Jew, I was telling this to the Reverend in the break, he said, well, we're all the same and inclusive. I said, yes, because you read the Old Testament and incorporate it into the New Testament, but being a Jew means that the New Testament is not true. Sorry, that's my view. Now, I can't impose that, my view, I really am not a very religious person, but my tradition. But I cannot impose that on other people. So long as I say this to my community and it is not taken out on others politically, that's exactly what a pluralist society is about.
Oh, and I agree, but and I think it's worthwhile to talk about what Islam is, because there's so much stereotyping and misinformation going on. So I understand why people are defending Islam by looking at the texts. But the problem is, I mean, even as you're saying, texts don't kill people, and this is what Yale theologian Collins says, right? They need to be shown not only what problems in textual issues, but that it's how you work within the community. I mean, here you have Bob Lentz, and I said before, this person has to be shown to anybody who thinks that, for instance, Christianity might be violent. Perhaps you could have a meeting with Dawkins or something like this, right? And Nietzsche described priests as Reich unterirdische Blutsauger. You know, he says they're pale subterranean bloodsuckers. So I don't think you're that way.
Bruce, do you want to touch upon that? In German.
No.
Go ahead.
Pass on that.
Let me just jump in. I think it's a great question and far deeper than the way I usually consider these things. But at least in my understanding of my faith, which I think it would be, yes, it is authentic, but that doesn't necessarily mean that some other is less authentic or inauthentic. I think that there's a unique piece in my interpretation of my tradition, which is certainly authentic for me. And I guess my understanding of both inspiration and authenticity is not some sort of mechanistic divine revelation direct from God's mouth to my paper, but rather through a process of communal interpretation, experience, historic transformation, and that is what over time creates, I think, authentic experience in the lives of people who follow it. I suppose, and I probably am going to trip on their deeper question, I would say as a Christian, if somebody is going to interpret the scripture to say Jesus would preach violent overthrow, I would say that's completely nuts. There's not a text in the verse. Well, maybe there is. I bring us a two-edged sword. So, but even in that, but if it's something off the top of my head that seems to be clearly not in the text, I would say, well, that may be your authentic reading of some other thing, but that's not sort of an authentic interpretation of Christianity. So it's hard for me to start naming with any kind of exactitude the criteria, but I would love to struggle to articulate some.
And again, I'm sorry, I don't want to take up everybody's time, and I'm sympathetic to that.
Yeah.
The problem that I'm trying to address is not what the correct reading of a text is. I mean, that's worthwhile. But if one were to say, Bin Laden's reading of religion is no less authentic a reading of Islam, even if hermeneutically correct, then Christianity would be an evolution from Judaism. So what makes you so sure that he's wrong per se, unless you're ready to admit that Christianity in general is just a misreading of Judaism? What makes it inauthentic? Because then we're faced with the possibility of saying, how do we convince people from other nations or so forth that this is an invalid religion if our own evolutions of religion are taken to be valid? What makes one evolution valid and another invalid?
There's an example that comes to mind for me with regard to Christianity, where there's this group of Christians who protest at military funerals. Has anybody seen this in the news? Yeah. And they believe that the reason that soldiers die in combat is because God hates homosexuals, and homosexuals are in the U.S. military. Therefore, soldiers died because of that. And what I'm trying to figure out here is, if that movement started to catch on, I suppose then we would really we're bothered by them, sure, but they're not catching on. What is allowing the Bin Laden version to catch on and allowing them to recruit? It's not an answer to your question, but that's the problem I think that I identify that bothers us more. If Bin Laden couldn't get anybody to show up other than his 15 guys who they have meetings in a cave and it's very annoying to everyone, but whatever he says his thing, that wouldn't bother us. The problem is that he's recruiting and has the capacity to kill. Just like if this group had the capacity to recruit and do more, I think it would bother us. It's that one is catching on and resonating and one is not. Not an answer, but an issue.
Next question. Wait.
He add something to that. It's my understanding that the bulk of the terrorists come from and I'm probably going to butcher the pronunciation, but the Hanabi school of thought. There's supposedly 5 versions of jurisprudence within Islam.
What was the word?
Hanabi? Okay. I'm studying. I promise.
Humbly.
Yes, and that represents the bulk of the terrorists come from that particular group, which is a very small segment of the Islam faith, and I think representing less than 5%. And that is, and his distortion of those thoughts or amplifications of what occurs there has only been made possible by his control of territory. As like in Afghanistan, where he was able to take kids that are 8 years old and basically brainwash them to his interpretation. I don't know if that adds to what you're saying, but really a perversion of Islam, from my understanding.
Go ahead. Wait, question, go ahead.
Leading right in
Wait, you can't talk until you have a microphone. For the webcast.
Thank you much. Leading right in, actually, in a sense, it's an extension, which I think is not actually bad, because what we're talking about in this round of questions here is terrorism and religion, which is Viktor Frankl said, and this is probably not an exact quote, that there are only two human races, the civilized and the uncivilized. So I think it's less a battle between one religious culture and another, and rather a battle within each religion for the soul of that particular religion. And I'm saying soul in the sense of how civilized, how decent are the representatives of that religion going to be? Who's going to capture the soul of that religion in terms of decency? Which leads me to the central point, which is that if in fact that is the issue, and if it's not actually a conflict between different rituals, different dogmas, different beliefs, but rather for the soul of decency in any given belief, then the practical outcome from that is that one does not aim for the extremists. One does in a military sense, obviously. But in a policy sense, all that outreach is not done to the extremists. It's done to the decent middle, A, and B, to the swayable, B, A and B. And that's where you put your, and it is a dialogue about shared values and shared striving towards decency, as opposed to a debate across belief systems. Thank you. That's just a comment.
Questions. We need questions. Ram, go ahead. Question.
Okay. Let me begin with 9/11. 9/11 heightened our vigilance extremely. After that date, we were really very suspicious of terrorism in any form. Then, of course, Bush invaded Iraq. But isn't there an old saying that our nation has always believed in, and it is, we cannot help everyone. Physically, economically, we can't. Now, on that basis, also knowing that terrorists are not easily identified as individuals or as groups, usually until they attack us in some way, doesn't that suggest that we should fall back on federalism, that we should let each nation handle their own terrorist problems? Whether they're successful or not, that's their problem. Let them handle it, and we'll take care of our terrorists. And of course,
Bruce, that one you have to answer.
Okay.
Yeah,
that's well, the main point that you raise, I think, is a very good one, and it's part of our weaknesses. I think Bin Laden and Al-Qaeda has been extremely effective at exploiting local grievances and then spinning them into a much broader global campaign, whereas we approach this issue as almost a one-size-fits-all, and we don't see any of the local nuances, and we think that what we refer to as Islam is monolithic, that it's, I mean, even recognizing the difference between Sunni and Shia is obviously taxing for some of our representatives in Congress, but there are further and deeper nuances. I think even the point that was just raised too, that it's not only the moderates that I think we need to identify and deal with, but also extremists who aren't violent. I mean, that's part of our problem too, is that we have a very, I think, narrow and very rigid definition of what moderates are. I think for me the break point is when you're using violence or not. I mean, we have plenty of extremists in this country as well that certainly have political rights that many of us wouldn't agree with, but as long as they're not resorting to violence, it's acceptable. And I think we have to have the same sort of view, which often we don't have. The problem, though, I think with your argument, which I think logically makes sense, but the problem with the way terrorism now is prosecuted is that because Bin Laden exploits these local grievances, he's seeking to, firstly, I think on the one hand, initiate individual sort of brush fires that he hopes eventually will become some giant conflagration. But also it's those individual brush fires that give al-Qaeda the opportunity to expand into new geographical areas that they may not have either had any residence or any presence, and therefore to exploit those sentiments to build something of a base, even if it's just a base of a few locals that they can capitalize on, and thereby to carry out acts of terrorism. But often it's that base can only, you're right, can only best be identified by local authorities. But the challenge is that those bases aren't permanent. Unfortunately, they're highly mobile, and they're constantly moving and shifting the same way globalization is occurring throughout the world, the movement of people and money. So therefore, terrorism by definition, I think in the 21st century, even more than the past century, is this transnational phenomena. Where terrorists, I think, are looking, they're as opportunistic as they are instrumental. Where they see defenses are lowered, or where they see there's an opening, that's where they'll strike, and often not against the interests of the country that they operate in, but against foreign interests based there.
Just on your point about each nation state doing what they can, I think that as Bruce was touching on briefly there, that transnational cooperation is extremely important in countering the terrorist threat against the United States. So we couldn't do a lot of what we do alone. We at CASE have a one-of-a-kind grant on transnational counterterrorism prosecution and cooperation. And what we're learning through that grant process is that a lot of the prosecutions that Bobby was talking about before could not have occurred. The interdiction actions could not have occurred, where the FBI will go in and pick up people while they're in the midst of putting that plot together. Could not have occurred without cooperation across borders. So it's tough for us to just buckle down and go into our own sort of hiding place. And then one thing that Bruce said, I'm being presumptuous to disagree with Bruce, but I think that there is a step before resorting to violence, which was suggested here before, which is that in hateful speech, which sort of touches on what the President was asking us to touch on before, which is fatwas which give you essentially a religious stamp of approval on the terrorist activity that you're about to undertake. A perfect example of this was the blind sheikh who was in prison passing messages through his attorneys sanctioning violence in Egypt. So there is a step, I guess, before violence, but you could relate that to violence, and I think.
Well, no, I would. Yeah. I would say that that's violence, if it's incitement or whether it's the commission of violence.
Next question. Yeah.
One of the most basic for the just everyday people is this concept that since 9/11 we have not had a terrorist attack in the continental United States. I'm just interested in, is the issue when or if we're going to have it? Because what Cheney and them has told us is that because we're keeping them busy in Iraq, they're not coming over here. I mean, that is a statement that they repeat. And I'm just interested in response to that concept of because they have not done it here, therefore the policy apparently has worked. And I just need some response. Whoever.
Bruce? Well, firstly, I think there have been plots, and I think serious plots against the U.S. I mean, the ones that I described in my talk, the Summers plot was I think, certainly, we would be having a different kind of meeting had even one of those airliners gone down, much less crashed into a city. There was certainly the plots in 2004 where a London-based al-Qaeda cell was instructed to sort of update and revise pre-9/11 attack plans and recarry out the surveillance. In fact, if you go to the website of the Metropolitan Police, I think it's metropolitanpolice.gov.uk, you can see the surveillance tapes that were actually taken. There was, of course, as we heard earlier, the Jose Padilla case, who had been dispatched here by Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. Ayman Faraz, who actually is from Ohio, who plotted. I mean, again, al-Qaeda, moves on parallel tracks. I mean, some of these plots were far more serious than others. I mean, the Summers plot, I think, was serious. The 2004 plot was certainly serious. Cutting the cables on the Brooklyn Bridge, I might put in the quarter-baked category rather than the half-baked. But it's still, people that are dangerously out there thinking of committing mass killing. So there have been plots, and I think in that respect it probably is a matter of not if but when, only because no society in the world, least of all an open and democratic one like ours, can hermetically seal itself off from these threats. I think the key is that we stop them, we deter them, and fundamentally there are, of course, gaps in our defenses. I mean, there's no doubt. And they're often, I mean, there's always information about people sneaking past airport screeners or in the ports. But the point is, I think from the terrorist point of view, they believe the U.S., and I think it genuinely is, a much more difficult environment to operate in than it was before 9/11. In the 1990s, bin Laden, I mean, literally said to his followers, this is a quote, that the U.S. is a benign environment, or some such, something similar, that this is an easy environment for us because we can get in easily, we can do what we want. Whether or not that's the case, I think it is more the case. But I think from the terrorist point of view, they do believe it's a much tougher environment. Now, the question of fighting them there so we don't have to fight them here. My view is that, especially in recent years, there's more than enough of them to go around. I mean, you can see the transformation that in the beginning of our presence in Iraq, 90% of al-Qaeda in Iraq were foreign fighters and 10% were Iraqis. Now that's reversed. It's about 90% Iraqis. I don't think the number of foreign fighters is diminished. They're just not going into Iraq necessarily. And I think the British would argue with this, really, a series of plots that go back to 2003, and especially the London subway bombings. They're fighting them in the UK. They're not only fighting them in Iraq. But here I think there's an important difference between the US and the UK, and even in Europe. In Europe, al-Qaeda over the past decade, or at least this is my interpretation, and you have to take that with a grain of salt, over the past decade was able to create an infrastructure and to put into place a base that they've never succeeded in doing here. And I'll give you an example. In the late 1990s, the British authorities already knew that some 3,000 British Muslims had left the United Kingdom to train in al-Qaeda camps and had come back. I've never heard, in the 5.5 years since 9/11, in any form, any American intelligence or law enforcement official or government official, even put a number, put a figure to the number of Americans that might have trained in al-Qaeda camps in the past decade and came back to the U.S. Many of them we already know. Adam Gahan, the Lackawanna Six, who clearly didn't have the stomach for the al-Qaeda type of terrorism, for example, who really were, I think, kids who just got, like John Walker Lynn, mixed up in something way above their heads. We're not talking about the Mohammed Siddiqui Khans, let's say, in the United Kingdom, that I believe were al-Qaeda agents even before 9/11, recruited people locally and then did the London subway bombings. So we don't, if there are Americans that are trained, it's in the tens, maybe a high estimate, the 20s, but not the same infrastructure. And that's why I think we've seen all these attacks from Istanbul, many of them that I named, Istanbul in 2003, Madrid, the London attacks, all these plots in London, and comparatively fewer here is because al-Qaeda doesn't have the infrastructure. That's why they had to import 19 people in 2001. That's why in 2004 they had to task a London cell to come to the United States to do reconnaissance. In my view, if they had some sort of capability here, they wouldn't have taken that chance of people firstly being sent to do the reconnaissance, returning to London, coming back again for the attack. And then this summer also, I think, underscored the dearth of resources that they have here because they were tasking again terrorists or would-be terrorists in the United Kingdom to launch attacks against the U.S., but from overseas. I mean, a different variant of the 9/11. But all that being said, you read the British Parliament's report of their investigation to the London subway bombings in July 2005, and what you see is that 2 months before, the British version of our National Counterterrorism Center lowered the threat level in the United Kingdom, believing, just like I'm telling you, they don't have a problem there, that's a problem in the continent of Europe, but it's different in the United Kingdom. And of course, they were very rudely surprised, so we can never be completely complacent. But I think there is an explanation that goes away from political rhetoric and that separates itself, let's say, from Iraq, that says why we've had less terrorism here.
We have time for 2 more questions. Ma'am, I know you want to ask it, and Dr. Neal, you want to ask a question.
I have a question here for the good surgeon, Dr. Hussain. You had mentioned in your presentation that one of our solutions would be to address poverty. And, of course, that's been mentioned many, many times, and poverty is widespread worldwide. How do you think about this in practical terms as a solution?
I will start out by saying this thing, that there is a catchphrase that to win the hearts and minds of people around the world. And I don't think that's working. The polls around the world show that people cannot differentiate in other countries between American policy and American people. At one time they did, but not anymore. Last year I did a 3-part investigative report for The Blade, the newspaper I write for, from Pakistan. And I went all over the country, including the tribal areas of Pakistan. I come from Peshawar, which is closer to Khyber Pass. That's where I was born, so I have roots there. And I was amazed that the disenchantment with America cut across all levels of religious adherence, a spectrum of religious observance from Orthodox to the liberal, the economic spectrum, as well as anything that you want. There was an overwhelming majority of people who did not like the policies of America. Your question is, how do you do that? I think that if we went in and we sought out people who are like-minded, and I'm not talking about fighting terrorism. That's a different issue. I'm talking about on people-to-people contact. How do you talk to people? Look at the model that in the 1960s John Kennedy had in Peace Corps. You can still come across people in Pakistani rural areas where they still talk about some young man coming from Ann Arbor, Michigan, spending 6 months or 1 year in the Peace Corps and changing their lives. I think that is something which is needed. It's a simplistic concept, but I think it works on local people. And I think unless we realize that if we don't do that, then it's going to affect us in the United States. I may have one more comment, and this was talking about as to why we haven't seen the terrorists here. I think there is a difference between the demographics of the British Muslims and the American Muslims. The British Muslims are very enclosed ghetto cocoons where they are under the influence of the imams, which are almost always imported from the old country. Whereas in America, we have a more integrated Muslim community in which the imams are, some are imported, some are local, and most of them are educated professional people, and they are more integrated in the community at large as they are as opposed to as in the Britain. And for that reason, I think the chances of this happening, that like it happened, 3,000 people went to Pakistan or the Afghan hinterland to get trained, I think it will be much less in case of America than it would be in Great Britain.
Last question, Bob.
I'm hoping this will be a question for the panel in this last session, and that is, how much should both American policy and international cooperation be focused on solving the problems that seem to be engendering excitement among the terrorists? And I think we all know what those problems are. And I guess my question is when local people can't solve their problem, how much of an obligation, and it endangers the rest of the world, i.e. Iranian nuclear power and possible preemination by another country, how much of an obligation do we and the international community have to make sure that that problem gets solved promptly and not after another 50 years? And the second comment I'd like to make is, having been a member of this of the roundtable that led to this conference, I just want to thank everybody for doing such a great job. This has really turned out to be a wonderful experience.
Who wants to take the second part? We agree. Let's do this. Bruce, you're going to answer the first question, and then we're going to turn it over, because at the end of the day, we have to answer the questions the President put forth. So a quick answer from you as to Dr. O'Neill's first question, and then we'll turn it over to a series of questions.
Well, my first response would be to say, just in general, that we shouldn't think that solving any one of the many problems that exist in the world today and give rise to terrorism in and of itself is going to end terrorism. I think there's an inherent good in resolving the Israeli-Palestinian issue. There's an inherent good in creating a democratic and stable Iraq, but all those things, I think, will help in at least diminish one additional hotspot that motivate and animates terrorists, but by themselves aren't going to address the problem. I mean, the same with poverty. I think it's entirely appropriate, and there's a good in raising the world's living standard, but in and of itself, I mean, what we find is that the majority of, in Pakistan, in fact, the demographics is that the majority of the Pakistani jihadi groups that are most closely associated with Al-Qaeda are people who are highly educated, who have, not necessarily just or only products of the madrasas, but rather have university degrees and often advanced degrees as well. So, on the one hand, I don't think we should look to any one solution. For me, one of the fundamental goals has to be is almost like the Hippocratic Oath of not doing any harm or not doing more harm. And we have to be very careful that of doing things and falling into the trap sometimes that radicals and extremists want us to do that strengthens them by provoking a reaction from us that may viscerally feel good and may at the time appear to be the right thing, but in the long term actually undermines not just our security but international security further. So it would be to proceed cautiously, I think. And in my view, especially in terrorism, is that there's no unilateral solution to the problem, that the most effective countering of terrorism has to be on a multilateral basis, which means what we do, we have to be very careful not to alienate our friends and allies or take them for granted as well. Even in the case of Pakistan, which is a very controversial issue, of course, with Al-Qaeda bases appearing there, with President Musharraf's rule and the lack of democracy, and many of our complaints about Pakistan providing either a launching pad for Taliban activities into Afghanistan and so on. But at the same time, almost all those plots that I described earlier that were disrupted with the aid of the Pakistani authorities. I mean, even the plot this summer against American airliners started with the arrest of a British Muslim was an Al-Qaeda operative named Rashid Rauf in Pakistan by the authorities. So this shows, how complicated this is and how there aren't any easy answers, and that even with a very close ally of ours, whom we now have somewhat ambivalent relations because of not knowing what to do and how far we can push the government for reforms and democratization, at the same time it's wrong to paint them as being completely uncooperative in the war on terrorism. Their cooperation is actually being not just essential, but effective.
All right, here's what we're doing. You want 30 seconds to add, and then we're moving on.
Yes. I want to add a macro point, and that is I don't disagree with anything that was said, but I think we talk about global terrorism, which is a reaction to globalization. And globalization has all kinds of side effects, internally as well as externally. I just read in the New York Times, I think yesterday, that the disparity in wealth in the United States has never been worse since the Depression. And so, in part, we also have to address the global problems raised by globalizations internally and throughout the world.
All right. Bobby Chesney. The President wants some answers. In the context of balancing, in the context of the Constitution, what, if any, First Amendment limitations are there for a potential legislative response to religion and terrorism?
That's a great question. When you guys, I think Greg mentioned Rahman, Sheikh Rahman, the other few minutes ago, and he, of course, was the incident you were describing was the more recent incident where he was trying to pass a message of approval for withdrawing from the ceasefire to EIG. Of course, he's in jail in connection with a seditious conspiracy conviction, and this was in connection with his role as the provider of religious approval for the cells that were involved both in the 1993 World Trade Center bombing and the planned Day of Terror in and around the New York City area all in the 1990s. And this charge that he was part of the conspiracy to levy war against the United States on which he was convicted, he argued that it was a violation of his First Amendment rights, both to freedom of expression and to freedom of religion, because in effect he was being prosecuted, he said, for simply expressing his religious opinions on whether certain actions were would be justified under Islamic law, under Sharia or not. When Greg started mentioning, I have the Second Circuit's opinion talking about that here, and I had highlighted this on the way into town. It just seemed like something that was relevant to our topic. Probably the single court opinion that's most on point for all of our discussions in this conference. I want to quote a few things here. there are a couple of answers to Abdel Rahman's contention. The court wrote, the first is that freedom of speech and of religion do not extend so far as to bar prosecution of one who uses a public speech or religious ministry to commit crimes. Numerous crimes, of course, are committed with speech alone. All these offenses that are then listed are committed through speech. Notwithstanding that political speech and religious exercise are activities most jealously guarded by the First Amendment, one's not immunized from prosecution for such speech-based offenses merely because one commits them through the medium of political speech or religious preaching. This, to me, underlines the point that we have plenty of laws on the books insofar as the criminal justice model is concerned to address a scenario in which you have a cell or an individual within the United States and the decisions made to pursue a federal criminal prosecution, even where the motivations are religious in nature. I do not see the First Amendment as an obstacle. There will, insofar as there becomes a significant effort to focus on a particular religious group, and in fact we've seen this, there will be arguments that, well, the FBI's growing interest in a particular religion, showing up at the mosque, listening to what's happening, starts to have a chilling effect. You'll read of communities where people perhaps are less willing to attend the mosque. Absolutely an important concern, because that ties directly into the fundamental security point that the community in the United States that we most need to be on board with counterterrorism efforts and to be involved with willing cooperation and sharing of information is, in fact, the Muslim American community. Notwithstanding that, I don't see it's a First Amendment violation or a restraint to pursue that type of investigative method or to pursue prosecutions where someone's religious speech may be involved.
So meaning you don't see, before we turn to Michel, you don't see a First Amendment restriction?
Well, I see First Amendment limits, but I don't see anything that's on the books now that would be relevant to use in pursuing any given particular fact pattern we might come up with. I don't see any of it as presenting a First Amendment violation. Certainly there are limits, but I think that we're within the limits.
Michel?
Okay, just want to make one point. This is a very complex issue, and that is that the United States stands almost alone in the limits, international covenants and the jurisprudence of all major Western constitutional democracies permit the criminalization of incitement to hatred based on something like race or religion. And in the this would violate the First Amendment. My sense is that we might be better off moving to the world standard in this respect, although I admit what is extremely delicate is that we don't want to deter genuine religious discussion and opinion saying that my religion is superior to yours and you're wrong in your religion for the following reasons. But there's a line between that, which may be difficult to implement, but nonetheless judges are paid to implement difficult distinctions, and a sort of religious propagation of religious hatred. It's not only the act itself. That's, I think, too far. That's too late. If there is vicious religious against a particular religion propaganda in a country, even in the United States, if it would be vicious anti-Muslim rhetoric. It would be nice to be able to have some limitations on it.
Let me just jump back in and respond. And it's interesting because I think in general, I'm probably more pro-government than Michel, all things being equal. But here I would disagree and argue against criminalization of incitement to religious hatred beyond anything that's already on the books. Largely because I don't see that as the nature of any kind of problem we have within the United States. I think we are differently situated than the British for reasons that were talked about earlier. For example, I don't have a sense that one of the problems we have is that there are individuals who are engaging in insightful speech and who are causing problems, and that they're not doing other things that already bring them within the scope of criminal prosecution. As for people outside the United States who absolutely are engaging in those types of activities in problematic ways, they're not really falling within the ambit of federal criminal prosecution to begin with.
Meaning that you would grant wide latitude for religious speech?
I would maintain our current status quo, in large part because of the line drawing problems that Michel referred to a moment ago, unless and until we ended up in a situation perhaps a generation or two from now, but certainly not currently, in which we had the same sort of relatively rampant amount of incitement going on within our own country. But I just don't see that as part of our fact pattern.
Dr. Hussain, you want to comment?
I just want to comment. I'm not a jurist lawyer. I don't know the fine points of law. But I know one thing, that if when Pat Robertson or Jerry Falwell or Franklin Graham says that Prophet of Islam was a pedophile or is an evil religion, it resonates with me. It bothers me. It goes right down to my core because I am a practicing Muslim. I'm a moderate Muslim. But I believe in the same institutions. And for that reason, if those people are allowed and nobody is condemning them or telling them that this is wrong, then I think there's something wrong with that. And I'm not saying to carry it to the level of persecution. What I'm saying is the society has to stand up and say, if I am a law-abiding citizen of this society for the past 40, 45 years, I've contributed to this society, then my rights as a practicing Muslim, as a Muslim, has to be protected. And if not by law, by the citizenry, as I would for other people. And that I have not seen.
And I would just say, I mean, I just think that's where, it's a Christian issue to have those three men stand up and say that. And so we have to take it upon ourselves from a more moderate stance.
Can I go with you when you talk to them?
Yeah. Here's a very practical thing that has nothing to do with law specifically or policy specifically, but in Ohio, in reaction to the rise of the religious right and the patriot pastors in the state in the last election, a group of religious leaders, Muslim, Jewish, Christian, Baha'i, Sikh, Unitarian, came together to say, look, there's something very important about the moderate religious voice reclaiming our voice of equity and empowerment and standing up and saying, that is nuts. That's nuts. We can't allow the Jerry Falwells and the Pat Robertsons to get away with it, because not only does it hit you at your heart, it hits me at my deepest conviction about what it means to be a person of faith in the Christian tradition. And I want to refer back to your comment. I do think there's a piece of this which is an intra-faith struggle to claim the high ground of decency and openness. And that doesn't mean water down our uniqueness or our truth.
That's true.
But to stand firm and say that is not part of what I call authentic Christianity, despite the issues and the problems with that. But so I think there's this battle to be waged, and we've got to stand with you, and I think that will bear tremendous fruit down the road in creating a kind of interfaith dialogue that actually can help shape, I think, national policy and international policy.
All right, Bruce, to you. As we begin the process of trying to articulate something concrete, how would you suggest or how would you address the question of how are other nations responding to religious extremism within their own border? Be it Jewish extremism, Muslim extremism, or Christian extremism?
Or Hindu extremism.
Or Hindu, or Buddhist, or whichever.
Well,
I mean, they're extreme too.
I mean, generally, we've had more success, at least with immigrant groups, in integrating them into our society, which has helped to, from the start, where you don't have to resort necessarily to measures to outlaw extremism. And when you think of it, historically, the United States has had far less left-wing terrorism than European countries have had, far less ethno-nationalist, separatist terrorism than European countries, for example, have had, and by the same token, I think less religious terrorism that may attempt to leverage off of religious terrorism. I think where other countries, particularly the United Kingdom, are being very effective is in relying much more on local policing and local community initiatives than we've seen in the United States. I still think that countering terrorism in the United States is fundamentally prioritized from a federal and a top-down level. And we heard earlier, I think that federal agents knocking on someone's door, I think, elicit a very different response when you have local police officers who may be doing it, and especially if they're local police officers who may indeed come from the community, or if not, at least they're familiar with the community. Also, I think that these general local approaches are tremendously important, because when you think about it, now New York is, of course, an extreme case given its population, but the New York City Police Department has 267 certified linguists who are fluent in Arabic, Hindi, Urdu, Pashtun, Farsi, And then we know the problems the federal government has had in attracting trained linguists, the fact that fewer than 1% of FBI agents have any knowledge, for instance, of Arabic. It's not to slam the FBI, but it's to say that there's a tremendous resource that we can tap into on the local level that's probably more effective than any kind of legislation, but that I think allays concerns about federal authorities, firstly, singling out people, and that also puts police officers and community workers in close contact with these communities and populations to find, that they will be able to have a hand on the pulse of whether there is any tendency to, or drift towards extremism.
And when you look at nations other than England, which we've talked about at length here, trying to learn what would be relevant to the American experience, what do you see in other countries?
Well, I mean, I'm really only familiar with the United Kingdom and the Netherlands and Europe because they're the most active. But I think they face very different problems in their societies because many of those who have gravitated towards religion feel excluded. I mean, their religion is is only one part of their identity that feels this exclusion from their from society at large. I mean, it's ethnic, it's cultural, it's racial in terms of their skin color, and religion is just one of the other ones. I think, though, it's countries that haven't moved in this direction that see themselves, some Scandinavian countries, for example, that have found it very difficult to be absorptive. I mean, their whole definition is not just a linguistic one or a nationalist one, but it's also very much the common racial features that they have. And there's then a dangerous undercurrent of people that feel excluded, and from their exclusion, they find either solace or explanations or solutions to their predicaments in whatever they can grasp. It may be religion, it may be some other form of political extremism.
John, when you look at Christian terrorism or Christian fundamentalists leading to Christian terrorism, is religion the glue or is religion the excuse?
Both. I mean, it's certainly foundational, a theological underpinning of. I mean, first I have a little trouble with. I mean, defining Christian terrorism in the context of America. Maybe the survivalists out in Utah or something
right.
claim. It's not something that I'm really familiar with, other than I know they exist and I know that they use certain Christian, and I guess the KKK to a certain extent. Yeah. I mean, from my judgment, it is the abuse of and therefore the use to justify. But I think it's important to lift up that I think they feel that they are justified in using the text like that, and they certainly find them. The Phineas Brotherhood and others looked at very specific texts to create an exclusive survivalist community that is grounded on religious literature. So I don't think it's not one of.
Are they disenfranchised? Is that what attracts them to religion?
Again, not a simple answer. I mean, I think they disfranchise themselves. But I mean, I think there's so many factors, including religion, and also many that go way beyond their religious faith, that are factors in why they interpret things as a certain way, disfranchise themselves, remove themselves, and act violently.
And then, Bobby, in terms of, back to what you were saying in terms of the First Amendment, when you have something like, say, the Branch Davidians or the KKK or any of those white supremacists, in terms of the First Amendment, do you shorten the latitude?
Tell me a little bit more about what you have in mind by shorten the latitude.
That you, at some point, say no more. And where and when?
Well, I'm not sure it's a First Amendment question. If the question is, do you cut them less slack in terms of the speech that they engage in? Again, I don't perceive the problem with groups like Army of God, which is a Christian-oriented or Christian-claiming anti-abortion violent movement, or Christian identity movements and that sort of thing. I don't see the avenue of responding to them either through prosecution or through policy measures as being one that's triggered by the point at which their speech has become too insightful, that they're being too effective at recruiting and so forth. One of the most important points to take away about the scope of federal criminal liability under the conspiracy laws, which would be relevant for a non-foreign audience, and to a lesser extent maybe the material support law, is that you can attach liability to conduct. You don't have to attach it to speech. You don't have to get into that. So the speech prong, I don't think, is a problem. Then there's the question of whether groups are being targeted in some sense because of the religious glue that holds them together, as we've been describing it. And again, for the reasons I was talking about a moment ago, I don't think that's a problem. So yeah, I don't see it as a problem. I think that you could decide at some point to devote more FBI resources towards domestic groups of this kind, and there may be arguments raised that in effect you're going to cause a chilling effect on interest or participation in these groups, and that does raise a First Amendment concern. I don't think it's a violation.
Michel, do you want to add something about that?
Yes, I want to point out that this speech-conduct dichotomy, which has worked in the United States so far, is a very dangerous, and again, I'm projecting things that could happen, maybe not right now. It's a very dangerous dichotomy after what happened in Germany in the pre-Hitler years. There's been many studies showing that Hitler could have never gotten away with what he got away with if there hadn't been a decade of Jew bashing of the worst kind. And there is a very, for those of you who are interested, there's a very good analysis of this in a decision of the Canadian Supreme Court, which went the other way than the United States, called the Keekstra case. This was an anti-Semitic high school teacher who just taught his students constant hate propaganda against the Jews, and then required in the exam that they repeat what he said in order to get a passing grade. And the Canadian Supreme Court, a divided decision, upheld his criminal conviction. Now, it doesn't have to be put him away for life, but just to show society maybe 30 days in jail. It's an exemplary punishment. And there's a very good analysis of the fact that we can't take for granted that people are rational, and as long as we can allow to say anything in all circumstances, as long as we don't allow to cross the line of conduct. Sometimes when there is a frenzied hatred of a group and it feeds on itself, it may not be enough.
There's also something to be said in First Amendment theory, though, for the idea of not suppressing speech so as not to drive underground those who are subscribing to these hateful ideologies. And they are certainly, in the examples you're giving, just despicable ideologies. That one of the traditional justifications sort of associated with with a number of constitutional theorists is that by permitting the most open marketplace of ideas, including for the most despicable forms of speech, we decrease the extent to which marginalized groups feel further marginalized. We hopefully reduce the chances that they may then resort to violence. I think we should maintain that as something to consider whenever we are tempted to go in the direction of criminalizing hate speech or group libel.
There's in many ways a triangle here at play. There's a view of the law, policy, and then religion. And we're trying to, for the sake of the president, tie this all in together. So before we get to final comments, I have one last question I think that I hope that all five of you can address, and that is what's the effectiveness or the ineffectiveness of legal intervention? Are these questions to be decided by the law, or are these policy dependent rather than legal dependent, in terms of how we're going to respond to what we've been talking about with the help of our analysts during the course of the day? Michel, I'll start with you and we'll just work our way down.
I think you need both. The law itself will not solve anything by itself. On the other hand, the law is an important tool, and as part of an overall approach, you can use the law. It is very important not to overreact. I agree. Well, I disagree with the analysis of Bobby. Ultimately, I don't want to revisit that issue. I think we both put our positions on the table. But I do think that the law sometimes is important because it works up to a point, but it's also sometimes important symbolically. Even when the law is violated, the fact that there is a law in a society, and you take that in a broader context, is quite important. You also need policy. You need community relations. It's a very complicated issue, and many of these issues are very intractable and will not disappear. But I think the most important thing for me is to try to think through, and this is why I mean it's a little bit of a propaganda for this day, but being only a minor participant, I think I can get away with it.
But doing a fabulous job.
Yes, assembling a conference like this and hearing from me was extremely interesting, hearing from people in totally different fields. You see the multi-dimension aspect of the problem, and obviously the solution has to be likewise multi-dimensional.
Greg?
I think that as I highlighted in my comments earlier, that certainly the law plays a part, but there's other elements to it. As Bobby highlighted in his comments, the evolution of the material support statute certainly highlights to us that as the challenges of terrorism evolve, the law can be responsive and change as necessary to, if not solve those problems, at least provide society a manner in which to say we believe that conduct is wrongful and therefore you should be punished for it. Another aspect in which I think the law plays a part is as we watch these different types of threats evolve. There's a difference between, if we look at what Professor Solomon was saying earlier about when individuals are exposed to images of death, it affects their perceptions of it. If you look at some of the manner in which terrorist groups communicate their messages through the internet, through the use of martyrdom videos, it may require that there are some tweaks and changes to our law on the books, or it may require that judges reassess their clear and present danger tests to determine whether or not the threat that the individual is communicating now poses a different threat. So I think the law certainly plays a channeling and organizing impact on all of our sort of interdisciplinary scholarship and thoughts on these things.
Okay, sure. I would agree with the two who have gone before. It's a multidisciplinary approach. As neither a lawyer or a policymaker, it would seem to me very logical that both law and policy plays a part in this. I would say, and it's even beyond that too. I think perhaps the role of the faith community is to always speak truth to power. And to hold them accountable in their law and their policy making, to equity and compassion and, dare I say, to love. Now, we can argue about what that means, but I think there's something really powerful about that. That is our critical place in this society to keep law and policy making in dialogue with the voice of a deeper voice.
Good. Dr. Hussain.
Well, John, I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not a policy person. I'm not even a preacher. I mean, so really, I'm so limited in my in my expression. But there's one thing which I want to bring to your attention, if I may, and that is that policy. There is a policy being followed by the federal government, and that is that there is a profiling being done, and I am one example of being profiled when I come back in the country. And one wonders that if I am coming every 3 to 4 months or 6 months going overseas, why do I have to go through the same process? I'm the same person. I have the same passport. I have the same mother and father. They haven't changed. And I am a person who is a professional in a community, and I can assure you that there are people who feel besieged for no fault of their own, and call it a guilt by association. But I think that the policy which is being followed is very discriminating.
Well, I mean, obviously, I disagree with anything that I've heard, and it has to be policy and law, but I think we shouldn't underestimate from a policy perspective why a legal approach is so enormously important, and it's actually in the process of the enactment of the laws that's absolutely critical, as well as their enforcement. But the enactment of the laws, I think, is absolutely critical for legitimizing the policy, for having the policy and the rationale behind the laws debated in Congresses or in houses of representatives, to have the government have to justify, or the government spokesman have to justify those laws, to have appropriate as necessary restrictions placed on them, whether they're sunset clauses or whether the legislation is shaped in such a way that the end product is slightly different than the policymaker might have wanted. But I think that's absolutely critical, not only in preserving our fundamental civil liberties, but also in getting the necessary buy-in and legitimization of the public for measures, and sometimes extraordinary measures, that have to be adopted to face and to address certain also extraordinary risks to society.
Let me agree with everything I've just heard, especially those last few comments. When you described law and policy as being distinct, I thought to myself, well, in certain respects, law is policy. Law is an expression of policy, and to a certain extent, policy operationalizes through law, not always, but law certainly reflects policy, especially in this context. It seems to me that the underlying issue, the core issue with any expression of legal policy, and of course we haven't talked about Guantanamo much at all, which sort of amazes me that we got through this whole day without doing that, but I'll bring it in now. Guantanamo is an expression of a series of complex legal policies, and it may be that we've had tremendous short-term gains from it at a tremendous long-term cost. I think it's the best example of where the question of whether a particular set of policies is lawful and consistent with international law, constitutional law, statutory law, etc., is a separate question from whether the atmospherics and the public relations impact, the impact on cooperation from communities within the United States and communities abroad is such that the larger calculus perhaps suggests that what is legal and reasonable in the short term is perhaps still legal, yet not reasonable in the larger scheme of things. I'm not suggesting Guantanamo is or is not in that category, although there's a pretty strong argument that even if lawful, the costs are becoming too much to maintain the status quo. I think you have to ask that question of all the specific legal policies. I think you have to get beyond the convenient and appealing large picture, forest-level view of balance between liberty and security, and you have to get down to every single individual legal policy that may or may not bother you. Interrogation technique, listening to phone calls, detaining someone in military detention in a particular place. You have to ask on a case-by-case basis, and you have to view it all through the lens of what Secretary Rosenfeld went to put as the question of, are we, to paraphrase, are we creating more enemies than we are incapacitating on a daily basis? That's the larger war of ideas. So let me just conclude by bringing it back to a conversation that Parvez and I had yesterday in the hotel when we first met, and we started talking about something that I think is, if I had the president's ear, the one thing I would want to say is we've somehow got to do better in the war of ideas. And as Parvez said, this is really a significant part of the question of better outreach. Not that we need to do the same thing and just sell it better, but we actually have to have, as someone described it earlier, getting more people with the cultural skills, with the religious knowledge, with the language skills, people from the relevant communities to go out there and engage in this debate. And I don't think we've done a very good job of that. And all the legal individual policy questions won't get us very far if we don't get that larger piece done correctly.
Before we move into the closing ceremony, please join me in warmly thanking our distinguished panelists. For anybody who's ever put together a conference, it's obviously not a one-man show. So there's a long list and long line of people who need to be publicly thanked for having done above and beyond the call of duty. I think I speak for both Jesse and myself, and I begin first of all with the two students who have done an extraordinary job, Rebecca and Matt. This would not have happened without the two of you, and this is truly a credit to the two of you. This also would not have happened with the woman who just walked in, Nancy Pratt, who is the organizer, the doer, the sender, the emailer, truly thank you. I also want to thank the students from the Journal of International Law who've been running up and down with the microphones. Sometimes it can be a pain, but it absolutely needs to be done. And so all of you who are here, who have left, I truly thank all of you also. I turn to my friend Ro Green. Without your generosity, this just never happens. And not only are you very generous, obviously, but you are truly passionate about this. I think this is really the time and the place for all of us to truly thank you for opening yourself up and making this happen. It would not have happened without you and your understanding of the importance of the subject. Thank you. And on a final note, and I hate to talk about myself, but this is my final event here at Case. I've accepted a position at the University of Utah School of Law, and this is the place for me to turn to the 6 research fellows who have made the Institute the most incredible thing I have ever been a part of. So let's go backwards. First of all, Aaron Page, who flew in from Washington, D.C., especially for this. Greg McNeal, who only graduated a year ago, and here he's already sitting with the panelists. I mentioned Matt and Rebecca. Sam Riyad, who, raise your hand, Sam. And last but not least, President Brian Field. When we started the Institute 2 years ago, under the direction of former Dean Korngold and former Associate Dean Shodash, the idea really was to do two things. One is to impact on the public debate, and two is to create, from my perspective, an extraordinary opportunity for students. These 6 students are the heart and soul of what the Institute is all about, and this is really the place for me publicly to turn to the 6 of you and truly say thank you very much. Questions and answers. We'll start with a few comments from Bruce.